What do you hold on to when life strips everything away? Home, work, dignity, even certainty, yet leaves your heart breathing. When Allah tests a soul to emptiness, is what remains weakness, or the beginning of faith in the darkest nights? There are seasons in life when everything familiar begins to disappear, quietly at first, then all at once. Not with noise or drama, but with a heavy stillness that settles into the chest. This is often how the hardest tests arrive. Not announced, not explained, just placed gently, yet firmly, into a person's life by the divine decree of Allah. This story begins in such a season. It begins with a man who once measured his days by routine and responsibility. Morning prayers, honest work, simple meals, and tired gratitude at night. He did not chase excess, nor did he dream loudly. He only wanted stability. Enough rizq to live with dignity. Enough peace to sleep without worry. Enough faith to remain upright when life leaned hard. But life leaned harder than he expected. One loss came quietly. Then another followed. What was once steady began to shake. The walls he trusted no longer felt strong. And with every unanswered question, his heart learned a new weight. Not anger, just confusion. Not rebellion, just exhaustion. Yet in the silence of those days, something else grew. A habit of turning inward. A slower pace of breath during prayer. A deeper pause before every dua. He did not understand what Allah was removing, but he sensed, somewhere beneath the fear, that nothing was taken without wisdom. Still, sensing is not the same as seeing. And when the final loss arrived, it did not knock. It entered without warning, leaving behind a life that no longer looked familiar. What remained was not certainty, not comfort, only a fragile thread of faith, stretched thin, but unbroken. This is a story about that thread, about what happens when everything falls away, except faith. The man lived on the edge of a quiet town where the mornings arrived without urgency. The call to prayer echoed softly between modest homes, and the streets filled slowly, vendors lifting shutters, workers adjusting worn shoes, the scent of dust and tea mixing with the air. His life was not extraordinary, but it was honest. And for many years, that was enough. He rose before sunrise each day, performing wudu with cold water that sharpened his senses. In sujud, his forehead pressed against the ground, he would whisper words of gratitude, not because life was perfect, but because it was steady. Stability, he believed, was a form of mercy. Predictability felt like safety. And safety felt like a blessing from Allah he never wanted to take for granted. His work was simple. Long hours. Modest income. But it paid the bills, filled the shelves, and kept worry at a manageable distance. He returned home each evening tired but intact, carrying with him the quiet dignity of a man who had earned his day honestly. He did not ask for more than what was written for him. He trusted the decree, even if he did not always understand it. Then, slowly, things began to change. It started with a subtle shift, reduced hours, delayed payments, promises that arrived late and left early. At first, he dismissed it as a passing difficulty. Every life, he reminded himself, bends occasionally. This was only a bend, not a break. But weeks turned into months. The bend deepened. Each night, he lay awake longer than before, staring at the ceiling as thoughts circled endlessly. Calculations replaced calm. What could wait? What could not? He began measuring time not by prayer, but by deadlines. Still he prayed. Still he whispered dua. But the tone had changed. Gratitude slowly made room for uncertainty. He told himself to have patience. That rizq is never late, only perfectly timed. That Allah sees what humans cannot. These were truths he had repeated to others for years. Now he was forced to repeat them to himself. The first real loss came without ceremony. One morning he was told his work was no longer needed. No argument. No explanation that made sense. Just a sentence delivered with polite regret. When he stepped outside, the sun was already high, as if the world had moved on without noticing the shift that had just occurred within him. He walked home that day slowly. Not because his legs were tired, but because his heart was. At home, silence greeted him. The walls seemed unfamiliar, as though they too sensed the change. He sat down and remained there for a long time, hands folded, eyes unfocused. His mind searched for meaning but found only questions. That night his prayer felt heavier. His forehead lingered longer on the ground. He did not cry. He did not complain. He simply stayed there, longer than usual, breathing through the weight. When he finally whispered, "Ya Allah," it was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was tired. Days passed. He searched for work with quiet determination. He woke early, dressed neatly, and walked through streets that once felt welcoming but now seemed indifferent. Doors opened briefly, then closed. Some offered hope that dissolved into silence. Others offered nothing at all. Money thinned. Meals became simpler. Choices became fewer. And with each passing week, something inside him shifted, not into bitterness, but into vulnerability. His sense of control, once firm, now felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He realized how much of his confidence had been tied to stability. How much faith had been comfortable when life cooperated. This was not the faith he had imagined. This was heavier, quieter, more demanding. Another loss followed. An unexpected expense arrived like a final weight placed on already strained shoulders. Savings vanished. Plans collapsed. The future shrank into a narrow, uncertain path. For the first time in his life, he felt fear settle deeply, not fear of hunger, but fear of being forgotten by the world. Yet even then he did not stop praying. He questioned. He wondered. But he did not walk away. In the stillness of late nights, he found himself reflecting on verses he had memorized long ago. Words about trials, about those tested beyond comfort. He had always admired such stories from a distance. Now he was living one. And living it felt nothing like inspiration. It felt slow. It felt lonely. There were moments when his dua felt unanswered. Moments when silence stretched longer than his strength. He would sit after prayer, hands raised, then slowly lower them without answers. Not because he stopped believing, but because he did not know what else to say. Still, something remarkable happened in that silence. He began noticing details he once overlooked. The way dawn light entered the room gently, without asking permission. The sound of footsteps outside during far. The calm that followed sincere prayer, even when circumstances remained unchanged. These moments did not solve his problems, but they softened them. He realized that while his life was shrinking outwardly, it was expanding inwardly. His prayers became less about outcomes and more about endurance. Less about timing and more about trust. He began asking Allah not for ease, but for steadiness. Not for answers, but for strength to wait. "Ya Rab," he whispered one night, voice barely audible, "if this is what you have written, then help me carry it with dignity." There was no sign in the sky. No sudden relief. But there was calm. And calm, he learned, was also merci. The town around him continued as usual. People hurried past, carrying lives untouched by his struggle. He felt invisible at times. Yet strangely, he also felt closer to something eternal. As if losing the world had sharpened his awareness of the one who never leaves. Faith, he discovered, does not always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it survives quietly, under pressure, under loss, under the weight of unanswered questions. And as the days moved forward, stripping away comfort after comfort, one truth became clear. Everything he relied on could be taken. Everything except faith. And that realization was only the beginning. The breaking point did not arrive with noise. It arrived quietly, on a day that looked no different from the ones before it. The man woke before dawn as he always did, but this time his body felt heavier. Not from hunger alone, but from the slow accumulation of waiting. Waiting for doors to open. Waiting for relief. Waiting for clarity. He sat at the edge of his bed longer than usual, staring at the floor, gathering the strength to stand. When he prayed that morning, his movements were slower, his sujud deeper, his breath uneven. And when he whispered, Ya Allah, the words trembled, not with doubt, but with surrender. Later that day, the final blow arrived. A message. Replied. Final. The last remaining opportunity he had clung to, the one that carried his quiet hope, was gone. No explanation. No apology that mattered. Just another closed door. This time, something inside him collapsed. Not his faith. His expectation. He sat alone in his room as the light faded, shadows stretching across the walls like reminders of how long this journey had been. For the first time since his losses began, he did not search for solutions. He did not calculate. He did not plan. He simply sat. And in that stillness, a frightening thought emerged, not spoken aloud, but heavy nonetheless. What if nothing changes? The question did not accuse Allah. It exposed the fear he had tried to keep buried. The fear that patience might lead not to reward, but to endurance without relief. That rizq might arrive in a form he could not recognize. That the decree might be harder than he imagined. His chest tightened. Tears finally came, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady. They fell without sound, tracing lines down a face that had tried to remain composed for too long. This was not despair. It was release. He lowered himself to the floor and remained there. No raised hands. No words. Just presence. For a long time, he stayed like that, breathing through the ache, allowing himself to feel what he had resisted. Plus, disappointment, fear, and beneath it all, a fragile but persistent trust. Eventually, he stood for prayer. Not because he felt strong, but because it was the only place left to go. That night, his prayer was different. There was no list of requests. No urgency. No pleading for outcomes. When he reached sujud, his forehead pressed into the ground longer than ever before, and from somewhere deep within, a different kind of dua emerged. Ya Rab, he whispered, voice breaking, I am tired of understanding. I am tired of waiting for signs. If you have taken everything from me, then take my resistance too. The words surprised even him. They were not rehearsed. They were not polished. They came from exhaustion, not weakness. And something shifted. Not in the world around him. Inside him. For the first time, he stopped measuring his faith by results. He stopped interpreting silence as absence. He stopped viewing hardship as punishment. Instead, he allowed the possibility, quiet and unsettling, that this was shaping him in ways comfort never could. He remained in sujud, breath slowing, heart settling. And in that moment of complete surrender, a realization settled over him like gentle rain. Allah had not abandoned him. Allah had been stripping away everything that stood between him and trust. Not as cruelty, but as wisdom. He rose from prayer lighter, not because his problems had vanished, but because his struggle against them had softened. The weight was still there, but it no longer pressed against his chest. It rested where burdens are meant to rest, on the one who gives them meaning. Days passed after that night. Externally, nothing changed. He still had no work, no certainty, no visible relief. But inwardly, everything had shifted. He woke with acceptance instead of dread. He prayed with presence instead of panic. He ate little but with gratitude. He walked through the town no longer searching faces for opportunity, but observing life with a strange calm. He had reached the place few speak about. The place where hope is no longer loud. Where faith no longer argues. Where contentment does not depend on circumstances, but on surrender. And then, unexpectedly, something small happened. Not a miracle. Not a dramatic reversal. Just a moment. An ordinary interaction. A brief conversation. A chance to help someone else despite having so little himself. He offered what he could, time, effort, sincerity, without expectation. And in giving, he felt something he had not felt in months. Purpose. That moment did not fix his situation, but it revealed something profound. That even stripped of everything, he was still useful. Still seen. Still held within the mercy of Allah. Soon after, an opportunity appeared, not the one he had wanted, not the one he had imagined, but one that fit the man he had become. It was humbler. Slower, uncertain, but it was halal, and it was enough. He did not celebrate. He did not rush. He accepted quietly, aware that this was not a reward for endurance, but a continuation of trust. As days unfolded, he noticed how different he was. How little he feared loss now. How gently he held blessings. How deeply he relied on Allah, not when things fell apart, but even when they held together. The greatest turning point was not the return of stability. It was the transformation of the heart. He understood now that the real test had never been poverty or loss. It had been this question: can you trust Allah when you no longer understand His plan? And he had answered, not with words, but with surrender. What he lost shaped him. What remained saved him. And faith, quiet, steady, unshaken, stood where everything else had fallen. This was not the end of the story, but it was the moment everything became clear. Life did not return to what it once was, and he did not want it to. The days that followed unfolded with a slower rhythm, one he had not known before. Mornings still arrived early, but they no longer carried urgency. He rose with calm, prayed with presence, and stepped into each day without the restless weight of expectation. What he had lost had reshaped his vision. What remained had refined it. The work he now did was modest. It did not restore his old status, nor did it impress anyone. But it sustained him. More importantly, it aligned with the man he had become, patient, grounded, and deeply aware of where his rizq truly came from. He no longer equated provision with abundance. He recognized it as precision. Exactly what was needed. Exactly when it was needed. There were still moments of uncertainty. Bills still arrived. The future still remained unwritten. But fear no longer led his thoughts. When anxiety tried to return, he met it with remembrance. When worry whispered, he answered with prayer. Not because everything was easy, but because he had learned where ease truly lived. He noticed how differently he held blessings now. A meal was no longer rushed. A quiet evening felt rich. Even hardship, when it appeared, no longer felt personal. It felt purposeful. The decree of Allah no longer seemed distant or harsh. It felt intimate, considerate, as though every delay carried intention. Sometimes he reflected on how close he had come to breaking, not because he lacked faith, but because he had not yet learned to surrender fully. Loss had taught him what comfort never could. It stripped him of illusion and left him with truth. That trust is not proven in ease, but revealed in endurance. People around him noticed the change. Not through words, but through stillness. Through the way he listened. Through the calm he carried into rooms. He did not preach his journey. He lived it quietly. And in doing so, he became a reminder that faith does not always rescue us from storms, but it anchors us within them. At night, when he raised his hands in dua, his requests were simple. Gratitude replaced urgency. Acceptance replaced pleading. He asked not for more, but for barakah in what he had. Not for explanations, but for closeness to Allah. And in that closeness, he found something greater than what he had lost. He found himself. Not the man defined by stability or success, but the one refined by patience, softened by reliance, and strengthened by trust. Everything he once feared losing had, in fact, been taken. And yet he had never been more secure. Because what remained, faith, was enough. And always had been. This story reminds us of a truth we often resist. Not every loss is a punishment, and not every delay is rejection. Sometimes, Allah removes what we rely on so that we finally learn where reliance truly belongs. What feels like emptiness may, in reality, be space. Space for trust, for growth, for deeper faith. When life takes more than it gives, the heart is tested. Not to see how loudly it can complain, but how quietly it can remain firm. Patience is not passive waiting. It is active trust. It is choosing faith when answers feel distant and the path feels unclear. And rizq does not always arrive in the form we expect, but it always arrives with precision, guided by the wisdom of Allah. If you are walking through a season where your dua feels unanswered, remember this: silence is not absence. Delay is not denial. The decree of Allah unfolds with purpose, even when the reason is hidden from us. Hold on, not to outcomes, but to faith. Because when everything else falls away, faith is what remains, and it is enough to carry you through the darkest nights. Dua. Ya Rab, for every heart carrying silent pain, grant strength in waiting and peace in trusting you. Replace fear with contentment, doubt with certainty, and hardship with closeness to you. Help us accept your decree with humility, and never let our faith leave us, no matter what we lose. Amen.